Soviet generals couldn't believe their eyes. American trucks were leaving their legendary T-34 tanks in the dust. What they discovered changed the entire Eastern Front. Welcome to WW2 Studio, where we uncover the untold stories of the greatest generation. Today, we revealing one of the most surprising moments of the Eastern Front, a moment when battle-hardened Soviet generals stood in disbelief as American Lend-Lease trucks consistently outpaced their vaunted T-34 tanks across the brutal Russian landscape. This wasn't supposed to happen. The T-34 was considered one of the finest tanks of World War II, a machine that struck fear into German panzer commanders. Yet here were simple American cargo trucks, built in factories from Detroit to Indiana, leaving these steel giants struggling in the mud and snow. Picture this. It's late 1943 on the Eastern Front. The Soviet Red Army has finally turned the tide against Hitler's Wehrmacht. Stalingrad has been won, Kursk has been defended, and now Stalin's forces are preparing for the massive offensives that will eventually push all the way to Berlin. But there's a critical problem that keeps Soviet commanders awake at night, a problem that threatens to undermine every tactical victory they achieve. Their army can fight, their soldiers are brave beyond measure, and their tanks are formidable, but they cannot move supplies fast enough to sustain their advances. Soviet-made trucks are breaking down constantly, spare parts are scarce, and the entire logistics system is on the verge of collapse. Tanks might win battles, but wars are won by the ability to feed, fuel, and arm your forces hundreds of miles from home. Then something extraordinary begins arriving at Soviet ports. Convoys of American vehicles shipped across dangerous Arctic waters as part of President Roosevelt's Lend-Lease program. Among the Sherman tanks and fighter planes come hundreds of thousands of American trucks, Studebakers, Dodges, and GMCs, built by the same companies making civilian vehicles back home. Soviet officers inspect these trucks with skepticism. They look almost civilian in design, without the heavy-duty ruggedness they expect from military vehicles. Some Soviet engineers dismiss them as typical American excess, too comfortable, too refined, not built for the hell of the Russian front. But what happens next shocks everyone from frontline lieutenants all the way up to Marshal Georgy Zhukov himself. If you appreciate these forgotten stories from the war that shaped our world, stories about the men and women who sacrificed everything for freedom, then subscribe to WW2 Studio and ring that notification bell. We rededicated to bringing you the real history that your father and grandfather lived through. The kind of detailed, authentic accounts that honor their service and keep their memory alive. And I promise you, stick around until the end of this video because I'm going to share an incredible fact about what happened to these American trucks after the war ended, something Stalin tried to hide from his own people for decades. Now, let's discover how American wheels changed the course of history on the Eastern Front. By 1943, the Soviet Union had achieved something remarkable. They were producing T-34 tanks at a staggering rate that left German intelligence officers in disbelief. Factories in the Urals were churning out these formidable fighting machines faster than the Wehrmacht could destroy them. Soviet tank production was a genuine triumph of industrial mobilization, with workers laboring around the clock in freezing conditions to arm their motherland. But here's what most history books overlook. Building tanks was only half the battle. Getting them to the front, keeping them supplied with fuel and ammunition, and maintaining them in fighting condition. That was an entirely different challenge, and it was one the Soviets were losing badly. The T-34, for all its legendary status, had a critical weakness that became apparent during long-distance operations. These tanks would bog down in the notorious Russian mud, what the Germans called Rasputitsa, the season of impassable roads. Their tracks would clog, engines would overheat from strain, and transmissions would fail after extended marches. Soviet crews joked bitterly that their tanks could defeat Germans, but couldn't defeat geography. Even worse were the Soviet-manufactured trucks that were supposed to supply these advancing armies. The ZS-5 and GAZA trucks were primitive by any standard. Underpowered engines, weak suspensions, and a reliability record that was abysmal even by wartime standards. These vehicles broke down constantly, and spare parts were nearly impossible to obtain because factories prioritized tank production over everything else. German commanders quickly recognized this Soviet vulnerability and exploited it ruthlessly. They realized that if they could disrupt Soviet supply lines, entire offensives would grind to a halt regardless of how many tanks the Red Army possessed. The answer to Stalin's logistics nightmare came rolling off assembly lines in South Bend, Indiana, Detroit, Michigan, and dozens of other American industrial cities. Three vehicles in particular would transform the Soviet war effort: the Studebaker US6, the Dodge WC series, and the GMC CCKW. Trucks that American workers built with the same precision they used for civilian vehicles in peacetime. These weren't crude military machines slapped together for war. They had comfortable cabs, smooth-running engines, and engineering that prioritized reliability over brute strength. When the first convoys arrived at Murmansk and other Soviet ports, Russian officers examined them with deep suspicion. To eyes accustomed to the rough, heavy Soviet designs, these American trucks looked almost fragile, too refined, too civilian, what they dismissively called soft American engineering. Then came the field tests, and everything changed. Soviet drivers took these trucks onto the same muddy roads and snow-covered terrain that had stopped their tanks dead. The results were astounding. The Studebaker US6, with its six-wheel drive system, powered through mud that swallowed Soviet vehicles. The technical advantages became immediately obvious. Those six-driven wheels distributed weight and provided traction that two-wheel drive could never match. The engines started reliably in -40-degree temperatures. When something did break, repairs were straightforward. American engineers had designed these trucks so ordinary soldiers could fix them with basic tools. But the truly shocking discovery came during speed trials. While T-34 tanks labored along rough roads at 12 to 15 miles per hour, these American trucks maintained steady speeds of 30 to 40 miles per hour over the same terrain, carrying 3 tons of supplies while doing it. The impact of American trucks didn't escape the attention of the Soviet Union's highest-ranking commanders, and their private acknowledgments tell a story that contradicted decades of Soviet propaganda. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the man who would accept Germany's surrender in Berlin, made a stunning admission years after the war. In candid conversations, he stated that without American production, the Soviet Union could not have continued the war. He specifically mentioned those trucks, saying the Red Army simply didn't have the mobility to conduct the massive operations that pushed the Germans back. Nikita Khrushchev, who witnessed the war firsthand before becoming Soviet leader, echoed this sentiment, crediting American vehicles with enabling Soviet victories during the critical campaigns of 1943 through 1945. These hardened generals had learned a profound lesson that changed Soviet military thinking. Mobility often matters more than armor. A tank sitting idle for lack of fuel is just expensive metal. But a reliable truck that delivers ammunition, food, and gasoline to the front lines keeps entire armies fighting. The statistics were staggering and impossible to ignore. America delivered over 400,000 trucks to the Soviet Union, more than twice the total number of trucks Soviet factories produced during the entire war. This wasn't just helpful, it was transformative. During the Great Offensives of 1944, when Soviet forces raced across hundreds of miles in weeks, American trucks formed the backbone of their supply columns. These vehicles kept pace with advancing tank units, ensuring that Soviet soldiers never outran their logistics. The Germans, still relying heavily on horses for transport, couldn't match this mechanized efficiency. The reliability of American trucks didn't just solve problems. It fundamentally transformed how the Soviet military planned and executed operations. Soviet commanders began restructuring their entire logistics system around the dependability of these vehicles. They could now promise frontline units that supplies would arrive on schedule, something that had been impossible with their old truck fleet. This predictability allowed for more ambitious offensive planning, longer advances, and the kind of sustained pressure that eventually broke the German army's back. One of the most iconic weapons of the Eastern Front, the feared Katyusha rocket launcher, found its perfect platform on the chassis of the Studebaker US6. Soviet engineers mounted these multiple rocket systems on American trucks, creating highly mobile artillery that could unleash devastating barrages and then relocate before German counter-battery fire could respond. The Germans called the sound of incoming Katyusha rockets Stalin's organs, and that terrifying music was made possible by American engineering. The Soviet concept of deep battle doctrine striking deep into enemy rear areas with combined arms operations, became genuinely feasible only when American trucks solved the logistics puzzle. During the race to Berlin in 1945, it wasn't just Soviet tanks rolling westward. Hundreds of thousands of Red Army soldiers rode to victory in the beds of Studebaker and GMC trucks, covering distances in days that would have taken weeks on foot. The contrast with their enemy was striking and ultimately decisive. While Soviet supply columns consisted of motorized American trucks moving at highway speeds, German logistics still depended heavily on horse-drawn wagons plodding along at walking pace. In modern warfare, this 19th-century approach was a fatal handicap. For the ordinary Soviet soldiers and drivers who worked with these vehicles daily, American trucks became objects of genuine affection and respect. They gave the Studebaker US6 a nickname that revealed their fondness, Studer, a term of endearment you'd use for a reliable friend. Soviet veterans who survived the war would speak about these trucks decades later with a warmth rarely extended to military equipment. They had stories that explained why. During the brutal Russian winters, when temperatures plunged to 40 degrees below zero Fahrenheit, Soviet soldiers witnessed something that seemed almost miraculous. These American trucks would start on the first try, while Soviet vehicles sat frozen and lifeless. Drivers didn't need to light fires under engine blocks or spend hours coaxing their machines to life. The Americans had engineered cold weather reliability into every component, understanding that a vehicle that won't start is worthless regardless of its other qualities. When repairs were needed, Soviet mechanics discovered another revelation. These trucks were designed for soldiers to fix, not factory specialists. An average Red Army driver could replace parts, adjust systems, and get back on the road with the basic tools carried in every vehicle. Compare that to Soviet trucks, which required specialized knowledge and parts that simply didn't exist at the front lines. These American vehicles became powerful symbols of Allied cooperation, physical proof that distant Americans cared about their struggle against fascism. The irony wasn't lost on thoughtful observers. Capitalist technology and capitalist production methods were powering the communist Soviet Union's greatest military victories, enabling Stalin's armies to plant the red flag over the Reichstag in Berlin. So what have we learned from this remarkable chapter of history? The key revelation is simple but profound. Speed and reliability beat raw power every single time. The most fearsome tank is useless without fuel, and the bravest soldiers cannot fight without ammunition. This story teaches us the broader lesson that won World War II, Allied cooperation. Victory didn't come from one nation's strength alone, but from America's factories working in partnership with Soviet courage and British resolve. American industrial might played a crucial but tragically underappreciated role in defeating tyranny, and this story of trucks racing across the Russian steppe perfectly captures how the greatest generation sacrificed on multiple fronts. Some fighting with rifles, others building trucks on assembly lines, all contributing to freedom's triumph. Now here's what they never told you in school. Stalin, almost immediately after the war ended, ordered that Lend-Lease contributions be hidden from the Soviet public. He wanted his people to believe they'd won alone, without capitalist help. Those American trucks continued serving throughout the USSR for decades. Some were still working in remote Soviet regions into the 1970s and 1980s. Rusted Studebakers can still be found today across former Soviet territories, silent witnesses to a debt never properly acknowledged during the Cold War. Only now are modern Russian historians finally telling the truth about how American trucks helped save their nation. This is the kind of real history they don't teach in schools anymore. The honest, complete story of what our generation accomplished. If you served, or your father served, or you simply honor those who did, subscribe to WW2 Studio right now. Hit that like button to help us share these stories with other history lovers who understand that remembering is honoring. Next time, we'll reveal the secret weapon that American factory workers sent hidden inside Sherman tanks. You wouldn't believe what they smuggled past military inspectors. Remember, these aren't just stories, they're your history. See you at the next one.